You're listening to Good People, Bad Intentions, the podcast that focuses on fighters and their stories. Join me, Matthew Pyne, as we learn lessons not just from in the ring, but on the larger battle of life. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to episode 0 of the Good People, Bad Intentions podcast. The reason that I'm calling it episode 0 is because most of the episodes will have a guest featured, and we'll just have kind of like a discussion, almost like an interview, if you will. But for the first episode, my idea was to just spend this episode introducing myself, the brand, and the podcast, Good People, Bad Intentions. I also want to speak about some of the podcasts that inspired me, as well as I want to talk about some of the goals that I have for the podcast, and maybe what's to come in the future. So, hello, my name is Matthew Pyne, and I am 24 years old. Originally, I'm from Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, Canada, but for the last few months, I've been living in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. And I have been involved in boxing for about 3 years. Now, there had been a period where I hadn't boxed for a while, so still it is 3 years, but I've never really lost focus and interest in boxing since then. So I guess what I first want to say about myself is that boxing isn't the first martial art or combat sport that I was interested in. Originally, I had started doing karate, and the reason I took up karate was because I was getting picked on in school. This is in middle school, and I guess I was looking different, acting different than everyone else. In fact, if I ever talk more about my childhood or when I was in middle school, I was quite the interesting kid. But yeah, I was getting picked on and bullied. So I went to see a child psychologist, and that is when he recommended that I do two things: that I cut my hair and that I join karate. So I did cut my hair right away, but it took a while for me to actually get into karate. But as soon as I got into karate, I joined with one of my friends, Hunter, and we both grew together as people doing karate. It was amazing. And so I started doing karate for a few years. I think it was about 4 or 5 years. And I was watching at the same time the UFC and MMA. And I was watching the fighters that had karate backgrounds that were competing in the UFC, such as George St. Pierre, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, Kyoji Horiguchi, etc., etc. And what I was really interested in was how they were taking the traditional L-shaped karate stance, and they were incorporating movement, very unorthodox techniques and kicks, and dynamic punches. So if anybody's ever done a karate class, what you will find is traditionally they often use straight punches. But when you think of something like boxing, punches aren't just straight, but they have a curve or an arc on them, So what I was noticing is that these fighters were having a lot more dynamic and diverse punches, and I was really interested in that. Unfortunately, at the time, what I was training and what I was competing in wasn't really lining up with that, because I was doing some sports karate, which certainly has a lot of benefits, but you're really not supposed to have any contact, and the conditions or the requirements in order to get points and to win them didn't really favor me and my style. So it wasn't until later when I had a roommate who was an MMA amateur fighter. He kind of restoked my interest in martial arts because I had taken a bit of a hiatus from karate, going to university and whatnot. And yeah, so I went and I did a couple kickboxing classes at a few different gyms and was feeling things out. But I eventually joined Titans MMA, headed by Peter Martel, that's in Bears Lake in Halifax, Nova Scotia. What was really fascinating was that they had a lot of people that have been in the UFC, like Gavin Tucker. They had Chris Kalidas. They had a lot of affiliations with things that I was interested in. So when I joined that gym, thinking that I was going to be doing MMA, they recommended, because my only real background was karate, that I did a discipline like boxing or jiu-jitsu to start. So I took up some boxing classes, and what I found was that I was more interested in boxing than MMA at that time. Now, certainly one thing I will say is that I'm still a fan of MMA, but at the same time, now that my interest is more on the boxing side, I'm hoping with this podcast that there can be a focus on what I'm interested in, which is boxing. So I still have that passion for martial arts and things. And certainly I want to have some people on here that are involved in mixed martial arts. But yeah, that's kind of how I got into boxing. Now I'm an amateur boxer. I train at Tribal Boxing in Dartmouth, headed by Bridget Stevens, as well as Jim Maloney. And I'm really fortunate to be there. It's been kind of a journey to get to where I am now, and I'm still just a beginner. But I'm hoping through all this, through the podcast, that I can share also kind of my experience and things that I've learned. But I certainly am not an expert when it comes to boxing. I still have so much to learn, but I'm also so interested in it, and I'm really excited to have some people on here who can speak to me and speak to us about this sport. So, the title of this brand, the title of this podcast, it's Good People, Bad Intentions. And 2 years ago, when I was training one day, I kind of had this idea for a brand called Good People, Bad Intentions, because Cus D'Amato, who was Mike Tyson's trainer and mentor previously before he had passed away, was somebody that really coined the term throwing with bad intentions. In fact, he has a lot of quotes that talks about that. And I guess what it is when you're boxing and you're throwing punches, you have the intent to cause real harm, and you're putting real amounts of power behind what you're doing. So there's a vicious, ferocious. You've heard what Tyson said about you've heard kind of the demeanor that Tyson had when he was competing. However, alongside that, what I have learned is that a lot of fighters, while in the gym, they are savages. They're taking a lot of punishment. They're dishing out punishment. A lot of them are not really getting paid what they're worth, and a lot of time has to go through to the point where you can actually make money from boxing. So these people are really good people, and the whole idea of being in the gym and working together with one another, teaching each other stuff that you've learned, has really made me realize that boxers, fighters are special people. So I thought Good People, Bad Intentions, you're kind of combining maybe the demeanor that I would like to have, which is to be still, a human, a person, somebody that you can get along with and talk with, but also have that edge to you when you're in the ring. So, I wanted to also speak about some of the podcasts that have really inspired me. The first one would have to be the Fight League Atlantic podcast. That's headed by Derek Clark. Derek has been a really amazing resource for me. He's been somebody that I've talked to quite a few times, who's helped me through the whole process of getting clothes created, about talking about, starting a business, about doing the podcast, etc. He's somebody that I do want to have on the podcast, but I just wanted to give him a shout out because what I really like about his podcast is that he's mainly focusing on giving exposure to athletes, coaches, those involved in not only just MMA, but also there has been some people in boxing and other categories of sport. And he's done really well, I think, and he's always having new shows on, new interesting people, very interesting conversations. And I'm really glad that I was able to get in contact with him. And in fact, he is the main inspiration for why I've took it upon myself to start this brand and to start this podcast. So thank you so much, Derek Clark. So the next inspiration or podcast that I'm really into would have to be The Fight with Teddy Atlas. This would be my main inspiration as far as what my interests are with boxing. So Teddy Atlas, he was Mike Tyson's amateur coach or trainer, and he's also been a trainer for so many people. I think he's been in the business for around 50 years or so. What I really like about this podcast with Teddy Atlas and Ken Rideout is it takes concepts that are in boxing and it connects the dots with life. I wish he didn't use that term, and I wish I would have thought of it, because it's such an impactful statement that it's not just the physical that they speak about within boxing, but also the mental aspects. And I find those aspects to be the most interesting. And in fact, I believe he believes that it's one of the most important and biggest parts of boxing is the mental aspect. Because again, what I spoke to earlier was that there's a lot of fighters who are not getting what they really deserve as far as money, or they're working upon getting to the point where they can make money. And so the mental aspect, it's really hard. It's really hard to be a boxer or a fighter, but it's also rewarding. And in fact, what he likes to talk about is that you get into a dark, when you're in the ring, it can be like a dark place, and you really get to see what you're made of. And it's kind of unique because there's not a lot of other things in life that really test you to that point, where as much as fighting for your life or survival for your family. Going against, your own body and it telling you to stop. I guess marathon running is pretty similar too, but there's not that possibility of not being able to, wake up. You get knocked out or hurt or killed. It's a vicious sport, but it's also a very rewarding sport. So the next podcast would be the MMA Hour with Ariel Helwani. It's had a few different incarnations. In fact, it's only been recently that Ariel Helwani has got his own podcast on again. Before he was working with ESPN. What I really like about Ariel Helwani's podcast is that he asks questions to fighters sometimes that maybe are a little intrusive, because he has a journalistic background and that's what journalists are known for. But he asks questions that are very valuable and impactful. He has a really good demeanor. He's also a fellow Canadian, so represent. And he's amazing. He's the best journalist in MMA, and I really have been enjoying when he crosses over to boxing. He did the coverage for Jake Paul versus Tyron Woodley, and I'm thinking, he also has guests that are boxers. So he's had Tyson Fury on, most of the more famous boxers, but still he's had them on his podcast. So it's really nice. He has probably some of the best interviews with boxers, especially if you didn't listen to Tyson Fury on that podcast or on that show. He speaks really well. Unfortunately, the length of his shows are a little too long for me sometimes. I listen to it when I commute to work a lot, but certainly with my podcast, I don't want it to be as long. I give kudos to him that he's able to line up so many guests in one show. Like he'll have like 4 or 5 guests, plus he'll have betting picks, being discussed. He talks for 4 hours straight, and it's true. He said this not too long ago. He's like the only person in the business that does that, and it's kudos to him. So yeah. In the last podcast that I don't really listen to too much after he got his Spotify deal is the Joe Rogan Experience. Joe Rogan is a very interesting guy to hear talk. Maybe you don't agree with him 100% on some of the topics that he talks about, but certainly one thing that the Joe Rogan Experience does really well, and he does really well as a person, is he considers a lot of different points of view and perspectives, and certainly has a lot of diverse amount of people on his podcast. Now, I would like to have more focus with my podcast instead of just having anybody that's famous or influential on the podcast. I'd like to have it more towards boxing, maybe fitness, MMA, that type of thing. And certainly the focus would be boxing. But he does a really good job, and he is like the OG of podcasting or online internet radio shows. Again, like Ariel, he has about 4-hour shows, sometimes 3-hour shows. They're a little lengthy. It's certainly too much for me to listen, but I know there's a lot of people that enjoy listening to his podcast. He has a lot of funny people like Joey Diaz on. I always enjoy his episodes. Joe Diaz and any of the comics that go on, just a hoot, holler. Having other comics talk to each other is just amazing. It's like fireworks. You get to see on the fly comedy. So yeah, that's some of the podcasts that inspired me. And the last thing I guess I want to discuss is goals. Certainly, I'd like to have people that on the podcast that I think represent kind of the whole idea that good people, interesting people to talk to. But my goal is to climb the ladder and be able to talk with people that I have personal interest with. I told my friend, I was like, wouldn't it be awesome if I could have somebody like Mike Tyson, somebody or one of my favorite boxers, to come on here and to ask him questions that I still am really curious to hear from. He's a interesting person. Some people like Mike Tyson. Some people don't like Mike Tyson. He certainly has a past, but at the same time, it's certainly interesting what has been going on and the kind of transformation he's gone to. And he has his own podcast, Hot Boxing. I didn't really mention it as an inspiration, but certainly Mike Tyson is an inspiration to me in and of itself. I read all of his books so far. So having guests that I'm interested in would be awesome. But also giving exposure to up and coming talent would also be something that's very important to me. So, if I get the chance to talk to somebody, an amateur fighter, a professional fighter, a coach, somebody who's interested in media within boxing, anything like that, I'd like to have them as a guest and discuss boxing and to see, give them some exposure if I do have any influence, and collaborate. So, yeah, my goal mainly is to improve my knowledge about boxing, improve your knowledge about boxing, have an entertaining and fun podcast. Certainly when the people that I have on are on. I'd like to have not just a really bland and boring interview, but talk about some interesting topics, have a good time. It doesn't have to be really formal. Like right now, I have some notes because I've done a few podcasts now, trying to test settings and other things like that. And I noticed like I kind of talk for too long about certain things and talked about things maybe I should have talked about in the first or episode 0. But yeah, this will be a learning experience. And I just want to talk about this too. So the podcast is going to be available on YouTube. It will be a video podcast. But I also want to post on all the other podcast platforms like Apple Podcast, Spotify, etc. So chances are, if you are listening to this podcast on your preferred podcast platform, then all upcoming episodes will be available on that. And the next thing is more so about a schedule, because I do think it's important to keep a schedule so that way people can keep tuning into your podcast. And I'm going to try to do an episode a week. I haven't been doing that well already because I said, I think last Sunday, that my first episode was going to come out. But here we are, the next Sunday. It is November 20th. It's not November. Yeah, what? It's November 21st. Wow, time flies. It is November 21st, 2021. So I'm going to certainly try to get an episode and a guest each week. I don't think that it's going to take or be that difficult, but I will have to go through some learning processes as far as having two people on, me and the other person, and changing cameras and posts and that type of stuff. So please be patient with me, guys. This is my first time doing a podcast. However, it's not my first time broadcasting per se. This is my second time. The first time I did some Twitch live streaming. I played some video games online every once in a while during the week. You can find me as Late Night Cafe if anybody's interested on Twitch. But I do not stream on Twitch anymore, and I don't play that many video games now. I'm working, boxing, and pursuing this. So I don't really have that much time to do that now. So the last thing I want to speak about is the clothing. So not only will I be trying to do the podcast, but I do want to try and do some clothing and clothing designs that I'm interested in. I guess my idea was Canelo, one of the biggest stars in boxing right now, and certainly one of my favorite boxers right now. He has No Boxing, No Life as his brand. Him and Eddie Reynoso, his trainer. I think actually his trainer might have started that before Canelo. But either way, they have a brand. They have almost like a manifesto, a way of living, and they have a lot of cool clothes tied in with that. And that's my intention with Good People, Bad Intention. So if you want to support the podcast, support everything that I'm trying to do, the best way right now would be to buy a hat or a shirt from the goodpeoplebadintentions.com website. Right now, stock is a little fluctuating as far as the sizes. If there is a size that somebody would like and it's not available, I can certainly put that on the next order. And soon, probably by next week, I will have hoodies available. It's getting cold, everybody. It's winter time. So now we're going to have some red versus blue, kind of good versus evil hoodies for sale. So you'll be able to get that on my website. Certainly if you're in the HRM, Halifax, Dartmouth area and you'd like me for me to deliver it to you, I can certainly do that as well. Or shipping via online. So yeah, I hope everybody has enjoyed the first episode 0 of the Good People Bad Intentions podcast. And my first guest is going to be which will be next week, but I'm not 100% certain when this will happen. I might have to switch my first guest. But my first guest will be my coach, Bridget Stevens of Tribal Boxing. And I'm really excited because this week Bridget has been nominated as the hero of the week for HRM for the smooth meal prep business from the smooth meal prep business. So Bridget, I'm really happy to see that you're getting recognized for everything you do in and outside the ring for your community, whether it's the HRM area or Eskasoni or the Mi'kmaq community. And yeah, that's awesome that you're getting recognized for that. All right, guys. Hope you enjoyed the first episode, and I look forward to the next. Take care.